to just those specific groups that you concede fall outside the birthright citizenship rule. Why didn't they refer specifically to those groups? Why did they adopt a general rule? They could have said all persons born or not, excluding Indians not taxed, and those ineligible under common law, are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. Or they could have said all persons born or naturalized in the United States, excluding Indians not taxed, and the children of foreign ambassadors or foreign invaders are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. But they didn't do that. They adopted a general rule. So what's the explanation?
I would say the Wong Kim work tells us what the explanation is, that the framers of the 14th Amendment, after overriding President Johnson's veto, wanted to adopt a universal rule with a closed set of exceptions. Believed that subject to the jurisdiction of the United States did that, and that term does describe both the universal general rule and the common law exceptions, with the sole additional American exception for tribal Indians.
Thank you.
Justice Sotomayor?
Ms. Ryan, I've not quite understood the Solicitor General's argument that lawful domicile somehow changes the U.S.'s dominion over a person or allegiance. Even in Justice Alito's examples, if your parents are Iranian, if you get lawful permanent residency here, that child still, by their laws, when it leaves the United States, must serve in the Iranian army, correct?
Well, I don't know the answer to that. What I can tell you is that under Wong Kim Ark, the court says, we don't care about problems of dual nationality. We don't look to other countries' laws in construing our 14th Amendment.
Well, it was undisputed there that Wong Kim Ark's parents owed loyalties to China, correct?
Sure, yes.
What I'm saying is, even if you become a permanent resident, you're not a U.S. citizen. So your primary loyalty still remains with your citizenship country, wherever you came from.
That's right, Justice Sotomayor. I take your point now.
You understand what I'm saying? And during temporary, whether it's lawful or unlawful, temporary presence in the United States, you are subject to the U.S. laws, correct?
That's right. The question that the 14th Amendment asks is whether the U.S.-born child is subject to U.S. jurisdiction when they're born.
Meaning, are they within the U.S. territory?
Exactly, other than people covered by that closed set of exceptions.
Oh, thank you.
That's right. In other words, the government's rule, which really is looking at whether someone has a divided allegiance because they're a citizen of another country, would exclude the children of all foreign nationals, and that isn't what they're saying.
Exactly. And so the only way that allegiance, lawful or unlawful, has no play in this question.
I would say that the relevance of allegiance is the relevance under the English common law rule that's embodied in the 14th Amendment. All persons born in the territory of the sovereign owe natural allegiance.
Except for the three limited exceptions.
Precisely.
Justice Kagan?
I think I'd like to take you back to the first question that Justice Alito asked General Sauer, and it was this question of, what do we do if we think we have a new problem that didn't exist at the time of the 14th Amendment? I don't think, actually, that the U.S. government argues the case this way, but let's put the U.S. government's arguments aside and just ask something like, well, everything that you're saying would suggest an answer to the question of people who, the children of people who are temporarily in the U.S. but here lawfully. Is there any way that there might be a different answer with respect to the children of people who are here unlawfully because of this new problem issue that Justice Alito has raised?
No, there is no difference. And of course, the government's arguments as to people who are unauthorized immigrants in this country all runs through and hinges on their domicile requirement. The first thing I would say in response is that, once again, it's crystal clear from Wong Kim Ark and from the debates that the framers of the 14th Amendment meant to have a universal common law rule of citizenship subject to a closed set of exceptions. And we can't take the current administration's policy considerations into account to try to re-engineer and radically reinterpret the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. The second point I would make is that, in fact, the framers did consider the concept and the actual problems of immigration that were coming up at that time. In addition to this, notable exchange between Senator Cowan and Senator Conness, where Cowan says, if we have this citizenship clause as part of the Constitution, we are going to encourage these gypsies, what he called gypsies, Roma, in Pennsylvania, whom he characterized as invaders, trespassers, and lawbreakers, will encourage them to come into our country because they're childrenly citizens. He says, Senator Conness, in your state of California, you will be facing a mass flood of Chinese immigration if we adopt the citizenship rule. And Senator Conness, himself an Irish immigrant, says, yes, and I am voting for that because I believe in citizenship by virtue of birth without regard to parentage. And the third point I would make is an historical one, which is that recall that at the time the framers are thinking about birthright citizenship, there have just been 15 or 20 years of unprecedented immigration from Ireland. The Know Nothing Party was dominant in the 1850s, just a decade earlier, and they were vehemently opposed to Irish immigration. They believed Irish Catholic immigrants were unassimilable and could never become Americans. But even the Know Nothing Party members of Congress believed that the children born in the United States to those Irish immigrants were citizens like anyone else. That's the intuition that the framers of the 14th Amendment had. Contrary to the government's arguments now, they wanted to grow this country. They wanted to make sure we had a citizenry to populate the military, to settle the country. And they also had an intuition that was consistent with the founding aversion to inherited rights and disabilities.
Thank you.
Justice Gorsuch? Justice Kavanaugh?
On Lynch v. Clark, which you cite several times in the briefing today, which I appreciate, the government's response is that that decision was questioned at the time and went unmentioned in congressional debates about the 14th Amendment. I just want to get your response to that point on Lynch.
Sure, not true, though the Lynch was not specifically mentioned by name in the 14th Amendment debates. It was a couple months earlier in the debates on the 1866 Act, where Senator Senator Lawrence talks about the great case of Lynch versus Clark, where it was conclusively shown that all children born here are citizens without any regard to the political condition or allegiance of their parents. And then, of course, they discuss the children of temporary sojourners elsewhere without mentioning Lynch.
Just want to isolate a point that you've mentioned, which is if the 14th Amendment used the phrase not subject to any foreign power to give a much tougher argument, and then earlier I think you indicated that that's what they meant, even though they didn't say it. I just want to give you a chance to unpack that, because I think that's
Sure.
If it said that, I think our history would be a little different, and I think the text, you can put aside the histories, because that's speculation, the text would be quite a bit different.
Sure. So let me answer in three parts. The first is that Wong Kim Ark tells us that, the court already dealt with this and said, look, the framers were trying to do the same thing with the language of the 1866 Act. To the extent you think that the language is ambiguous or not as good, let's look at the operative text subject to the jurisdiction thereof. The second point I would make is that it's clear from the debates that the framers, in using the phrase not subject to any foreign power, were thinking about ambassadors. And I believe that Senator Wade at one point says, Well, I wanted to start with the phrase, all persons born in the United States are U.S. citizens. But then I thought, oh, wait, we have these temporary visitors. In fact, the government points to this quote. He says, oh, there are these temporary visitors. We can't make and we can't make their children citizens. That's ambassadors. And that's very clear from.
So if that had been the text, your argument would be that was understood to be narrower than its text would read.
Yes.
But that's not the text, so I guess we don't need to deal with that.
Sure. And that brings me back to my third point, which is you can't read not subject to any foreign power the way the government urges you to without making the children of all foreign nationals non-citizens, and that's clearly not what the framers were doing.
Justice Alito and Justice Kagan raised an interpretive question that I think is important, which is, are the exceptions, you've used the word closed many times, frozen, or do we reason by analogy to the exceptions that existed based on things that were unforeseen at the time? This comes up in the Second Amendment now, comes up in free speech law. And how do we think about whether it's possible that there could be an additional exception based on modern circumstances, reasoning by analogy to the exceptions that exist? I'm thinking in particular about the non-citizens unlawfully in the country, not the temporary part, but the non-citizens unlawfully in the country.
Sure.
Could you reason by analogy? You've used the phrase several times in the fiction of extraterritoriality, and could that apply? And if not, why not?
Sure. So here, I agree with Professor Whittington, who says that the government's position here is not positing a new application of the rule, but a challenge to the rule itself. And I think that's right. We know that the 14th Amendment's rule does provide for a universal rule with a set of closed exceptions. Wong Kim Ark says so at least twice. It says in an earlier passage that the framers were not trying to introduce any new exceptions. To the contrary, they were trying to foreclose any caste-creating exceptions like the court had created in Dred Scott. The second reason we know this is that the debates themselves had the framers saying, number one, we are declaring what is already the law in this country, at least for white Americans, and we are putting any further exceptions to birthright citizenship outside the reach of any future Congress. They were very concerned about that. That's the whole impetus for the Citizenship Clause. And the third thing I would say is that that it would be contrary to the central purpose of the 14th Amendment Citizenship Clause to admit new exceptions. For all those reasons, the entire history of the Citizenship Clause is driven by the notion that we don't want to have any other exceptions.
And then relatedly, just a separation of powers point, but get your answer. I understand your point about the executive order, but Congress's authority under Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, I guess the answer you just gave means they don't have any authority to look at this, even if they passed it 435 to 0 in the House and 100 to 0 in the Senate and said, we're carving out a new, by analogy to the existing categories, a new exception. Your point is, no, they're closed, they're frozen forever.
Correct. And the way I would put it is that the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment, again, has a universal rule with a closed set of exceptions. It sets a floor. So the Congress has, under the Naturalization Clause, the power to expand citizenship to other people not covered by the 14th Amendment, and obviously they have in many ways, but they can't go below that floor that the Constitution sets.
I think Mr. Sauer acknowledged that, and you mentioned this in your opening, that if we agree with you on how to read Wong Kim Ark, then you win. So that could be if we did agree with you on Wong Kim Ark, that could be just a short opinion, right? That says the better reading is respondents' reading. Government doesn't ask us to overrule, affirmed.
Yes.
Then last question though, why would we address the constitutional issue? This is the last one. Why would we address the constitutional issue given your argument on the statutory? Our usual practice, as you're well aware, of course, is to resolve things on statutory grounds and not to do a constitutional ground.
Sure. You know, I think we obviously have these two paths to a win here. We're happy to win on either or both of them. I do think it would be prudent for the court to reaffirm its decision in Wong Kim Ark, where it's a landmark decision about the definition of national citizenship in this country. I just think it would be prudent for the court to go ahead and reaffirm that, but of course we're happy to take a win on any ground.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Justice Jackson? I'm sorry, Justice Barrett.
So I have a question about the exceptions again. So in your interchange with Justice Kavanaugh just now, you were talking about it as a closed set of exceptions. And said that way, it sounds like exceptions that people had in mind at the time of the ratification, but that were not explicit in the amendment. But I took your brief to be arguing that subject to the jurisdiction thereof is the language in the 14th Amendment that refers to those exceptions. Am I right?
That's right.
Okay.
It describes them.
It describes them. And would you say, this goes back to a question that Justice Gorsuch asked General Sauer, our relationship to the Indian tribes is different today than it was at the time that the 14th Amendment was ratified. Let's put aside Section 1401. Is a tribal Indian born on a reservation today on tribal land a natural-born citizen under the 14th Amendment?
Under the 14th Amendment, no. Of course, Congress has provided for citizenship for all tribal members in the
By statute,
Act.
by statute. And so is that because what's subject to the jurisdiction of meant when you say closed set of exceptions, it means that the jurisdiction as it existed at the time of the 14th Amendment is still the jurisdiction today? So let me just be a little bit clear. Justice Kavanaugh asked you if we could create new categories by analogy. So there may be other sorts of people who were present here to whom this subject to the jurisdiction in the same way that we were talking about, the bubbles around ambassadors or the soil of occupied territory or the soil of tribal land. Perhaps those new carve-outs could exist by analogy today. Like if the United States carved out some portion of some state and suspended it from its jurisdiction. Wouldn't the principle still apply?
No, Justice Barrett, for two reasons. The first is, again, that there is a closed set.
But why is it closed? The language doesn't say it's closed.
Sure, we know it's closed because the very purpose of the Citizenship Clause was to foreclose new exceptions. That's clear from the debates. And I would say that the language describes a closed set as well, because you can't imagine another situation. The government's trying to make us imagine another situation, right? Yeah. They say, look, what if Congress, in order to do an end run, in order to change the meaning of the 14th Amendment as to unauthorized immigrants' children, Congress can say, we are not going to exercise jurisdiction.
Well, not quite, because it's redefining jurisdiction. It's not quite analogous, right? Because the government's domicile theory is a little bit different than the jus soli theory, right?
Sure, that's right. I'm just saying that in the second step of their argument as to undocumented immigrants, where they have to get around the fact that undocumented immigrants, by and large, are domiciled in the United States, they're trying to say, look, we're gonna manipulate the law either to define domicile or to carve out, to say, just wave a magic wand and say these babies are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States. There's still a missing factor under that original meaning of the 14th Amendment, and that's it. There is another sovereign who can exercise jurisdiction over this person, even though they're in the United States.
Turn this one on for me in here.
The question you asked Justice Alito, the difference between an ordinary non-ambassador or foreign national and everyone who's subject to one of those jurisdictions is that even if you take the government's argument and say a foreign national is subject to their country of nationality, to the governor's desk. In the United States, if I'm a French national in the United States,
Him and I had a conversation.
to the United States, arrest me and try me for a crime under French law. And that's what sets ordinary foreign nationals apart from ambassadors.
I mean, I understand. That wasn't quite the hypothetical. I understand that. Let me just ask you. No, that's okay. Let me just ask you one last question about Indians. So I gather what you're saying is that Congress cannot expand the set of, we'll call them exceptions, right? but you're saying it can't contract them either, and that was the Indian example. So what if, again, putting aside section 1401, what if our relationship with tribal Indians has changed so much that we would say, no, Indians really are fully subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in the way any other, natural born citizen is? You're saying that that doesn't change the constitutional status of Indian citizenship.
Let me be clear. What I'm saying is that the meaning of the 14th Amendment is we have to go with the original public meaning. And obviously at the very time that the framers were, thinking about the 14th Amendment, at the time of ratification, that relationship between the United States and tribal nations was in flux. Right, the government has made various arguments about Congress's authority, but the way the framers thought about it and the way that Wong Kim Ark describes it is that there was a unique constitutional status, unlike any other relationship between sovereigns in all the world, between the United States and the Indian tribes. And that is what gave rise to the pre-existing exclusion of Indian tribal members from U.S. citizenship, and that's what the 14th Amendment captures.
Hey, Jack.
Justice Jackson?
This is John.
So
How
I
you
want to
doing?
understand how you are responding to the government's
Got a
argument
question for you.
that because temporary visitors and
I think we got a
undocumented
terminal
immigrants are
problem.
still governed by their
You
own
know where the
countries,
front
and
window
in
is in the
government's
office?
take on this, you can't have two.
All down in those
You can have
window wells,
allegiance to
those
two different
windows
sovereigns.
are termites, and on the
Those
floor
groups
too.
can't have the requisite allegiance to be subject
do
to
they
the
have
United
wings?
States for the purpose of the 14th Amendment. That's what I hear the government saying. But I do
I had
think
to
that
get
that
tuned
seems to
into that
rest
question.
on a different
Hang on just a
understanding of
second, but I
allegiance
thought if you had a
than
chance, come
what
over and
was
look at it.
in the English
I didn't
common
want to
law.
call
And
Bill
then
and
when
pain
we
until
understand what the
let
English
somebody look
common
at it
law
that knows more
thought
about it than me.
about allegiance, you can see that you can have allegiance to two different sovereigns at the same time. This kind of goes back to Justice Alito's questions. I mean,
Well, these are
was
just
thinking about this,
seem like they're
and I think
hundreds of
there are
tiny
various
things.
sources that say this, that you obviously have permanent allegiance based on being born in whatever country you're from.
Yeah.
That's what everybody recognizes.
Hang on a sec.
But
Let
you
me see if
also
I-
have local allegiance when you are on the
I'll get her to
soil
take a picture of them
of this
and,
other sovereign.
and then,
I was thinking,
you want me to call you back, or-
I'm a U.S. citizen and visiting Japan. And what it means is that, if I steal someone's wallet in Japan, the Japanese authorities can arrest me and prosecute me. It's allegiance, meaning can they control you as a matter of law. I can also rely on them if my wallet is stolen
I'll tell her and I'll call you back.
Under Japanese law, go and prosecute the
I'll call
person
you
who
back.
has stolen it. So there's this relationship based on, even though I'm a temporary traveler, I'm just on vacation in Japan, I'm still locally owing allegiance in that sense. Is that the right way to think about it? And if so, doesn't that explain why both temporary residents and undocumented people would have that kind of quote-unquote allegiance just by virtue of being in the United States?
That's absolutely right, Justice Jackson, and that comports with the plain text of the 14th Amendment as it applies to everyone born in the United States other than those subject to the exceptions that were baked in a close set. You owe natural allegiance as a U.S. born citizen. If you want to look at the parents of those people, and let's say the parents are foreign nationals but not ambassadors, the parents owe temporary allegiance.
Right, so the babies get the permanent allegiance piece of this, and the parents get the local allegiance piece of this. So to the extent we're looking for allegiance, we have it.
That's right.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Rebuttal, General
Take
Sauer?
pictures of them and send them to him, and I'll call him back. And said he might have to get
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Justice Kavanaugh, turning to Lynch against Clark, that you raised didn't come up when I was talking about. Keep in mind that we say it's questioned at the time. It's questioned by a higher court in the same state, the state of New York, and the Ludlam decision in 1860 specifically said that someone who's traveling or sojourning abroad, though born in a foreign country, is not born in foreign allegiance. So obviously there is tension within that very state, and that's what contemporary commentators noted. And I make a more fundamental point about that. Lynch is not interpreting the 14th Amendment because it predates it. So it's not looking at the language of the 14th Amendment. It's looking at, what does the word citizen mean, for example, in the clause. So there's an anachronism to their reliance on it. And I think that turns to a point that Justice Alito emphasized. Once you get to that language of the 1866 Civil Rights Act, where Congress said not subject to any foreign power, clearly, we are no longer dealing with the British conception of allegiance, because Calvin's case and Blackstone say whether you're subject to another foreign power is irrelevant to whether or not you become a citizen. So, again, the concession that I heard to be made that those two mean the same thing, which this court held in General Building Contractors, that the Civil Rights Act is the same scope as the Citizenship Clause of the 14th Amendment. Once you're saying not subject to any foreign power, Congress has clearly departed from the common law, the British conception of allegiance, like monarchical conception of allegiance. They have adopted the Republican conception of allegiance, and there's all kinds of evidence going back to the late 1700s that that's the way they thought about it. And there was a reference, I think, in my friend's presentation about the Marshall Woodworth treatise from the late 1890s. That treatise also, just like Lynch against Clark, the language they quote is actually describing the case of the law, the status of the law, before the adoption of the 14th Amendment. So if you actually look at the treatises we cite again, I mean, Wharton, Morse, Justice Samuel Miller of this court, Lesser, Black, Hall, Winchester, Taylor, Westlake, Ballant, there's this consensus going from the time of the 14th Amendment onward. They're looking at the specific question of temporarily present individuals in the jurisdiction. All those sources say their children are not citizens. And that goes both before and after Wong Kim Ark. You see a similar consensus actually in the congressional debates, where whenever it comes up, temporary sojourners, it's understood, the context indicates it's clearly understood that those children are not citizens. And I would therefore finish where I began with drawing a stark contrast and turn back to the first question that Justice Thomas acted. That Republican Congress in 1866 had a very, very clear understanding that the children of the newly freed slaves have the requisite allegiance to the United States. This was all about overruling the grave injustice of Dred Scott and making sure that allegiance was granted to the children of slaves. However, you have this contrast of a very, very strong, impressive consensus, both in the original understanding, in the congressional debates, and carrying over into commentators for 50 years afterwards, that the children of temporary sojourners are not covered. And for those reasons, we ask the court to reverse. Thank you, counsel. General, the case is submitted.
You've been listening to the oral arguments in Trump v. Barbara. Now, the oral arguments you are hearing are concerning Executive Order 14160. That is President Trump's birthright citizenship executive order, which undoes the notion that anyone around the world, this was said in this case, all 8 billion people around the world could have a child in the United States of America. And those individuals under an 1868 constitutional amendment, the 14th Amendment, would become U.S. citizens. John Sower posing and positing that possibility before the Supreme Court in a contentious but civil back and forth. Hello, everyone. This is Outnumbered. I'm Kayleigh McEnany, here with my co-host, Harris Faulkner. Also joining us, Kennedy, host of the Kennedy Saves the World podcast, Kayleigh McGee-White, Fox News contributor, and Lawrence Jones, co-host of Fox and Friends and the host of Revival with Lawrence Jones, which debuts tomorrow on Fox Nation. More on that later. But first, let's bring in Carrie Urbahn, Fox News legal editor. Carrie, these arguments were fascinating. John Sower saying domicile. Domicile means what you consider to be your permanent residence, was intended when this was made a constitutional amendment in 1868 and the subsequent precedents that were referenced, like Kim Ark, which was continually referenced. I want to bring up birth tourism, though. This was fascinating. We know that anywhere between 1 million, 1.5 million, perhaps Chinese nationals have come to this country, given birth. Their children are now U.S. citizens. That was a stat mentioned in the argument. But one of the justices said, that's irrelevant here. That's policy. That's not law. But we heard pushback from John Sower saying this was not what was intended in 1868, Carrie.
Right, nor was it intended, I think, by the 1898 Supreme Court, who created birthright citizenship as we know it today. John Sauer made the point that I think there are over 500 birth tourism companies in China that come over here. You know, and Justice Alito raised the context of the 1898 Supreme Court case, Wong Kim Ark, that created birthright citizenship as we know it today. And that was the people, the parents of the person who was fighting for a citizenship had been domiciled here for quite some time. They were Chinese nationals, and they had been trying to become citizens. But at the time, there was strong anti-Chinese sentiment, a lot of racism. So it was basically impossible for Chinese nationals to become permanent citizens. So the Chinese parents go back to China, they bring their kid with them, so he returns to the U.S. as an adult, tries to get into the courts, they say you can't come in. He goes to the Supreme Court, he wins. So different context, and certainly not the exploitation of our citizenship clause that we're seeing today, with people just crossing the border in order to have babies, or entire companies being devoted to bringing people over, pregnant women, holding them up in houses in Beverly Hills to have a baby just to fly back to their country. Now, Kaylee, I would say this, I thought there was a lot of interesting discussion around the 1866 Civil Rights Act, and that was because the language in that says specifically that if you're born in the U.S. and not subject to any foreign powers, you are a citizen. And then 2 years later, we have the 14th Amendment, the Citizenship Clause, and they put in that wonky phrase, if you're born in the U.S. and not subject to the jurisdiction thereof, you're a citizen. So the question that was posed to the advocates was, well, it's the same Congress, it's 2 years apart, does that mean the same thing? Because that makes things a lot more clear, especially when we're talking about people who are here from other countries who are having kids. Now, the ACLU attorney did concede that it meant the same thing, but look, at the end of the day, I think this one is a closer call than all of the people who were decrying this as crazy would like to, that it's a much closer call than they realized it would be. I'm not sure where the Supreme Court justices will land. It feels like they're leaning against the administration, but I will say this, they were taking the arguments very seriously and asking tough questions to both sides.
They were. And to me, I go back to that hypothetical that was posed. 8 billion people in the world. So if they came here, had a child, then you were saying that all of those people can become citizens. It seems preposterous and certainly not something that was envisioned by the framers. But I'm curious, you mentioned we did hear skepticism from the justices, but you noted it was a little bit of a closer call. Is that what you discerned from their questions, which I know is always a fool's errand when trying to read the tea leaves of the court?
Yeah, because, Kaylee, for so long, and you know this, you and I both served in the first Trump administration, if someone even mentioned ending birthright citizenship, they were written off as crazy, that's right-wing fringe stuff, this is nuts, the Supreme Court would never take this seriously, and then two things happened. One, the Supreme Court decided to take it up, which means that they think it's worth taking up. And two, we heard oral arguments today where they were considering the arguments very carefully. Now, I will say this, there was, and I'm not surprised, though a little disappointed, there was not much of a discussion of the real-world implications of what birthright citizenship results in, right? There wasn't any conversation about, well, is it fair for someone to just pop over here, have a kid, and now that child retains all the benefits of the United States versus someone, say, who was born in another country, moved here when they were 3 years old, and then say can't run for president someday, despite the fact they've been here their whole lives. None of that was dismissed more as policy concerns, but, we live in a real world, and these are the real world implications, and I think people are listening and watching this and thinking, well, is this fair? But again, we'll see what the Supreme Court does. There's a lot of conversation about what domicile means, and so we'll see.
Well, John Sauer pushing back hard that those real-world implications matter. I agree with him. Carrier Bond, thank you.
Thank you.
Harris, another portion of this is that you had the sitting president of the United States there. Yeah. First time in history. We're told he was there for about an hour and 45 minutes. A long time.
Yeah, a long time, and I thought this was interesting. The ACLU Executive Director, Anthony Romero, said this before the president arrived. If President Trump wishes to come to the Supreme Court to watch the ACLU school him in the meaning of the Constitution and birthright citizenship, we will be glad to sit alongside him in that very court. Any effort to distract from the gravity and importance of this case will not succeed. I just find it interesting that when you look at the numbers and you look at those real-world issues, everybody should have a seat at the table. I'm so glad that we cover this and we can only have the audio for everybody. But since 2018, you can capture, and I don't know if our team has this, I think they do, because I found this and sent it to the team earlier, he's really been talking about this. This isn't something that the current president woke up with and had just like a brainstorm on. Trump in 2018 was reacting as a candidate back then, ahead of 2020, and as a sitting president, to birthright citizenship. Watch this.
The Democrats want to continue giving automatic birthright citizenship to every child born to an illegal alien. Even if they've been on our soil for only a matter of seconds. Hundreds of thousands of illegal immigrant children are made automatic citizens every year because of this crazy policy. Congress has never passed a law requiring birthright citizenship for illegal aliens, and the Constitution does not, I say that to the media, does not require it. Read it. Because illegal aliens are not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States.
Now, so then he was then schooling the ACLU apparently. So this was a back and forth, right? I mean, you know that this is a political issue. It's a bigger one than that. Just, I'll leave you with this. Of the 192 to 195 countries in the world, only 32 have unrestricted birthright citizenship the way we do in the United States. That means 160 plus countries don't have that. More than 80%. Citizenship depends on the parent's nationality. And just to give you a couple of examples that we're familiar with, Germany is one of them, Japan, China, India. Parents in the UK must be a citizen or settled like indefinitely with permission to remain in that country. So, you know, we don't just stand alone. It's our shores that they come to the most. And we don't hold that sovereignty in the way that 80% of the world does.
And Lawrence, John Sower pointed out when you read the first 28 words of the 14th Amendment, the part right after, subject to the jurisdiction thereof, is and of the state wherein you reside, which makes you think you need to reside in a state, you need to be domiciled. Here's why I think that's the case. When you look at these numbers, Eric Eggers, I spoke to him Saturday, there are more than 500 firms in China that facilitate people coming from the Chinese Communist Party to give birth here in the United States. Obama enabled this through loopholes dating back to 2009. And what that could mean is 1 million new voters by 2030. Imagine that. Communist Party voters.
Well, at that point, it becomes a national security issue. And I think, you know, there's a legal component to this, obviously, but there's also a common sense aspect of this. And if they're not going to go along with this, the court, then maybe Congress needs to reaffirm this in a different way to prevent this from happening. I do want to take on the president being there in person. I do understand that that is unprecedented, but the president, if you look at the document, which I spent some time looking at the briefing yesterday, the president is the petitioner. Now, this is happening.
His name is on it.
His name is on the document. Yeah. And although the United States government is representing him in court, this has only been done a handful of times. And when Nixon and Clinton did it in the past, they weren't the original filers of those things. The president is taking this on head on. I did find it discouraging that there was not a lot talked about the original context of this. You know, I spent some time yesterday going back, looking at newspaper articles from the New York Times in the 1800s, looking at what the Chicago Tribune was talking about. They were talking about slaves. Right. And so to see the battle that was fought, and then 3 constitutional amendments that were filed, freedom isn't free. And I think so often when we look at these Netflix specials and all that, we put this slant to today's time on it. We need to take in the context of what was happening in the country at that time. And I don't feel like there was enough time spent on that. There was a lot of time spent on the domiciles, but not so much on the context at the time.
Well, and now I better understand that, because when you consider 80% or more of the countries in the world, it's based on the nationality of the parents. Right. This is the only place. So that means you really have to fight for, well, what do you mean ownership and allegiance and domicile? You really have to dig in on it.
That's what that was my point. It's like, look at what was happening during that period of time. They're talking about slaves, And I think the court allowed them to introduce these other factors. And I understand that is part of the argument that they want to present there. But that wasn't happening during that period of time. They were talking about the slave. And there was even one point, if you look at the op-eds during that period of time, the slaves, then slaves at the time, were worried about their children being re-enslaved. So give them their right to citizenship. All of that was completely ignored during that hearing today, and I thought did a disservice to that moment.
Yeah, it's different to be brought to this country for slavery and then to, brought, not willingly, but then to break into the country, to
100%.
nullify our sovereignty and to come into this country. Those are two different things.
Well, Trump v. Barber, we will continue to follow it as the court makes their decision in that case. But now to breaking news in the war with Iran. Well, we've been watching the Supreme Court. Israel is being pounded by Iran. Sirens sounding over Tel Aviv as a barrage of missiles hit the nation. Let's bring in Jonathan Hunt with more. Jonathan.
Kaylee, Israel in general and Tel Aviv in particular have been under almost constant bombardment throughout the day today. One of the most intense bombardments, in fact, since the very early days of this war. Just about an hour ago, we had an hour-long series of sirens. We watched as the interceptors were launched from this area at those missiles, which came in one after another from Iran. And this, remember, this is the start of the Jewish holiday of Passover, and there had been warnings from Israeli officials that they feared that Iran would try to send that kind of bombardment over. We had some impacts throughout the Tel Aviv area and other areas. One 11-year-old girl, for instance, critically wounded. She is in the hospital at this point, as we understand it, and dozens of others have been injured. But it has been a really intense day, and Passover officially started just about 30 minutes ago when the sun set here. So while Israelis gather together for the traditional dinner tonight, they are doing so under this cloud of fear that this bombardment will continue. The Iranians wanting, obviously, to disrupt what is a very important Jewish holiday. Kaylee.
Our prayers for that 11-year-old girl and the dozens injured. Jonathan Hunt, stay safe. Thank you. And all of this setting the stage for President Trump's remarks at 9 p.m. Eastern time tonight. President Trump giving an important update on Iran. Tune into Fox News to watch the president's remarks live. Well, tonight, 4 people will take off for a journey around the moon after nearly half a century in the making. What's at stake for NASA's historic launch? That's next.
Forget the warm-up. DirecTV got hot. They're on fire with more MLB games than anyone. Welcome to the big leagues, kid.
How old are you?
11.
Out there.
One plate. In here, as many plates as you want. Plates and plates and plates and plates and plates and plates of protein. Out there, teeny tiny shrimp.
But in here, big butterfly shrimp.
In here, you have a choice. Out there, madness.
Like a relentless weed, moderate to severe Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis symptoms can keep coming back.
Break away to what's possible with Tremfya.
The only IL-23 blocker for Crohn's and UC to offer self-administration from the start.
With symptom relief as early as 4 weeks, remission at 12 weeks, 1 year, and even 2 years.
Some had visible healing of their intestinal lining. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections and liver problems may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Healing is possible with Tremfya.
Backed by over 15 years of clinical research. Ask your doctor about Tremfya today.
Hey there, just stop what you're doing. Pray with me.
We come to you in this season of Lent with a humble heart, a heart that wants to grow closer to you. Help us, Lord, to give you our lives. Empty us of everything holding us back, Lord. Fill us with your love. Use us for your good, Lord. In Jesus' name, in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come pray with me some more. Join me on Hallow.
One tiny candle illuminates 1,000.
Awaken! A Great Awakening. Rated PG-13.
We started Row with one mission: make supplements people can trust to work. That's why every formula we make uses liposomal delivery.
Half century. The Artemis 2 mission is scheduled to blast off this evening from Florida's Kennedy Space Center. If weather permits, it looks gorgeous now. The historic moment marks the first crewed lunar flight since 1972. And 3 Americans and 1 Canadian will journey around the moon on a 10-day flight before returning home to Earth. Former NASA astronaut, it was such a special day yesterday on the couch. Butch Wilmore was with us, and he spent nearly, 286 days in space, stuck up there, after a system failure aboard the spacecraft designated to bring him home, and he again was with us. And we talked about the challenges ahead for the Artemis crew. Watch this.
You've got the Earth rotating, right? And then you've got the moon orbiting the Earth. So the rotation of the Earth, the landing point off the coast of San Diego has to be in the right place when you burn to go to the moon, because this is a free return trajectory. You got to hit it exactly right and grab the moon's gravitational force and come around the moon, just free flight, and then all the way around. Very, very complex.
He called it a slingshot, and Kennedy, U.S. Navy Captain Butch Wilmore, really schooled us yesterday. This is difficult, and it's brand new all over again. We haven't seen it in a long time.
Yeah, a lot of math there, and a lot of uncertainty, actually, because this will be the farthest that human beings have ever traveled from Earth. It actually exceeds the distance in 1970 for Apollo 13, and Apollo 17, I think, was the last crewed mission to the moon. They're not landing on the moon, they're going around the moon. It's still considered a lunar mission because the aboutness has to do with the moon itself.
They're going on the far side.
Yeah, they're going on the far side of the moon in our lifetime. So few eyeballs will ever glimpse what they are about to see. And Christina Koch, who is the lone female astronaut on the crew, she said she really hopes that this is a time to unite a divided country in a way that happened with the space program and the lunar program in 1968. When we also felt that our country was ripping apart politically at the seams. So hopefully a moonshot like this can bring us back together, where we all look into the heavens with great curiosity about what lies beyond, and we'll have some new witnesses to tell us exactly what they see firsthand.
Preach it. That's exactly the point, right? They'll have testimony for all of us when they get home. Kaylee.
Well, Kennedy, I don't know, I've been reliably informed that Katy Perry was actually a part of one of the longest trips to space ever, so maybe they'll invite her to this one as well.
Not a chance.
Yeah.
She's Canadian now.
I think that was
fired.
And this is one of several trips back to the moon that the administration has said that they plan to take. So this is sort of the inaugural trip, and that they hope will make it easier for additional trips in the future to even create some sort of official base on the moon, which would be pretty cool. So maybe it will be a source of tourism in the future, especially if Elon Musk has his way. I think also, just as Americans though, this is what being a superpower really means. I think of just some of the headlines from this week, where you obviously have the United States military defeating one of our main enemies without barely lifting a finger. And then you have Elon Musk, one of our greatest innovators, who has just released new Neuralink technology to help ASL patients speak for the very first time. And then with the very minute amount of GDP that we spend on space exploration, we're going back to the moon just because we can. There is no other country in the world that is capable of this kind of greatness. And I think especially as we celebrate the 250th year, it's something that should bring all of us together.
Well, as an American, there's a lot of joy at this moment. It was great seeing Butch yesterday and getting to see him on the couch for Outnumbered as well, and the depth that he has, and that just shows you what you need to be complete to be an astronaut as well. But I think, President Obama abandoned a lot of the space program. And I think this president not only established the Space Force, but realized the national security that is involved with space as well. And the funding that he is now reinstituted. There's a real competition when it comes to the Chinese right now. And I'm so glad that we realize the threat. Part of the reason that we can't see what's going on in Iran right now is because they have put a blackout right there. And normally we would have someone like Elon Musk be able to put his services there for us to see. The Iranians have blocked that. Part of that is through space. Right? And so that's why we need to dominate this space completely, just to bring this home on why it matters.
Oh, good play on words.
If we are really a country about the American dream, we need those new voices. We need those new testimonies and stories.
Even though there is a Canadian on the crew. That's okay.
Oh, would you stop?
We'll allow it.
But we need to sow those seeds of the dream can be so big you can't even see it. It can be in rarefied air. And that's what this I can't wait for little kids to watch this. I mean, you've got little ones at home.
Yeah, and my littlest one, Blake, got to watch this. And it was really cool. And to your point about Obama dismantling it, I went with President Trump May 27, 2020, and we were supposed to see the first launch of astronauts into space in over a decade with SpaceX. And it didn't happen. It was scrapped. But 3 days later, it was put back on the map. There was a 50-50 chance of takeoff. I brought my little daughter, she was just a few months old, and stood there with my husband and alongside President Trump, and we watched the first liftoff astronauts into space from the United States in almost 10 years. To your point, he wants a moon landing by 2028. He doesn't want to around the moon. He wants a landing by 2028. China wants one by 2030. My money's on President Trump achieving that before China. He is responsible for our quest back into space.
Quick go around the couch. Anybody own moon boots? Because I think we're going to need them.
I'm not going to space. No way.
They look fantastic, and I'm getting
We'll send you there.
Oh, I love that. Kennedy's ordering her.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. All right, we'll move. Not happy, but at least the story is moving forward with some honesty and perhaps personal accountability. Tiger Woods with a bold request after his DUI arrest. What the star golfer is planning after his latest rollover crash, he says he will pull back for a moment and get some help, work on himself. And there is more. Stay close.
I'm William DeBane.